This is a very interesting topic. SHC, spontaneous human combustion, sudden human cremation. Now, a person becomes a pile of powder and leaves behind perhaps a partial leg or shrunken head amid combustibles that weirdly escape a fire that seems to be so fierce it exceeds what happens in a crematorium. Now, despite fascinating cases that span centuries, this haunting phenomenon is so bizarre, frightening, and opposed to common sense that its existence must be denied by mainstream fire science and medicine today. But one who does not deny, however, is Larry E. Arnold. He's the director of Parascience International. And after discovering the truly baffling burning of Dr. Bentley in 1975, he has traveled the world documenting this rare, but not impossible, enigma. Now, his groundbreaking research and controversial book, ABLAZE, The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion, it challenges the popular idea that SHC is crack pottery and a myth to be debunked. It takes curiosity, plus courage and thoughtfulness to delve into the high strangeness of SHC. Its exploration is indeed high adventure, one worthwhile to those who know that not everything is yet explained, that the real mysteries still exist. Now, ABLAZE is available through Amazon and directly from Larry himself at parascience.com. I highly recommend this book. It's packed with tons of stuff. So, without further ado, let's get started. What led you to this?
What led us to this was reading a book when we were in junior high school by Frank Edwards called Stranger Than Science. It was a paperback. I think at that time it cost us 35 cents. And it had compilation of all kinds of weird stuff, 14 stuff as we call it today. And one chapter in Mr. Frank Edwards' book was called Incredible Cremations. And it dealt specifically with one lady who lived in St. Petersburg in 1951 who had an incredibly fiery fate that fit the definition of what Justin just described to you as the classic concept of spontaneous human combustion. And we never forgot about that. When we went through high school and then into college studying mechanical engineering, we talked to our professors about this and nobody had ever heard about it. And when we came out of college and had a shift in consciousness and a career change, we remembered back to that book that we read in junior high school, and lots of people at that time were looking into UFOs and cryptids, and those fields seemed to be fairly well represented, but we couldn't find anybody who was studying this thing called spontaneous human combustion. So we thought we'd go down to the Library of Congress, live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, so it was not too long a commute down to DC, checked into the Library of Congress, and tried to find some books about SHC. Couldn't find any. We went next door to the newspaper archives section of the Library of Congress and tried to pull up some newspapers from St. Petersburg, Florida, Tampa, Florida in 1951 to see if anybody, any reporter, any credible news source had reported this alleged case of so-called spontaneous human combustion that afflicted Mary Hardy Reeser. And what we discovered was that Frank Edwards had not made up the story. This was front page news back in 1951 in the major newspapers on the west coast of Florida. And it dealt with a lady, as we later discovered, was actually a native of Pennsylvania. She grew up about 30 miles from where we're located here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And in fact, what's left of her is buried in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania at the West Chestnut Hill Cemetery, which is about 10 miles from where we live. So we're kind of in the locus of this very strange event that supposedly could not happen. What did happen to Mary Reeser on the morning of July 2, 1951, was that her body was found reduced to a pile of rubble consisting of a foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, part of tissue that was identified as part of her liver, and a head that was said by the local authorities at the time to have shrunken in size to a size of about a teacup grapefruit, all suggesting an incredibly hot, high temperature, long duration blaze. And yet surrounding combustibles in her apartment, aside from the chair in which she sat, piles of newspaper next to her, daybed linen nearby, all of those escaped damage by what should have been an intensely fearsome blaze. Also, there was no odor of burned human flesh at the time. In fact, the first responders said it was kind of a sweet aroma in Mary's apartment. Local officials at the time were completely bumfuddled. They had never found or investigated a case like this, and they were quite mystified. At the time, a world-renowned forensic anthropologist, Dr. Walton Marion Krogman, was vacationing in St. Pete, Florida. He heard about the case and took a professional as well as a personal interest in this episode because he himself had conducted a number of experiments on the effects of fire on various types of tissue, including humans. And he wrote at the time that he couldn't explain this. It caused the hairs on the back of his neck to bristle and stand up. It was so frightening to him. He actually admitted in writing and later to us in person that had he not investigated this case firsthand, he would not have believed it. He would have called it impossible. He told us that in his experiments, in order to ashen a human body to the extent that was found in Mary Reese's apartment would require controlled scientific conditions and a fire that was in 12 hours in duration, reaching a temperature of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Incredibly high temperature, considering that lava that flows out of a volcano is usually about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So how can you have a fire that's supposedly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit burning for 12 hours in an apartment that shows no damage from heat or flame other than to the victim in the chair in which she sat?
Yeah, and speaking of that, I know you had sent me, a bunch of slides, a lot of really disturbing photographs. Are there any in particular?
Yeah, you're welcome to show the slides. The ones that are titled Weiser would be a good place to start. Her tombstone is, as we said, about 10 miles from where we live, from where we're talking to you fine folks this evening, over in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, at the West Chestnut Hill Cemetery. We visited the tomb site. In fact, we've talked to relatives next of kin of Mary Weiser, and it's a common family lore in the Weiser family, a kind of fame that they didn't particularly want to have. But history says there's something very bizarre, quite inexplicable to this day, befell Mary Hardy down in St. Pete the night of July 1st into the morning of July 2nd, 1951. She was last seen alive about 9 p.m. The evening of July 1st, in fact, by her son, who was a physician by trade. She'd taken 2 Seconal tablets, and it was rumored that she might take another 2 Seconal sleeping tablets that night before calling it a day. And the debunkers are quick to jump on that and saying that, well, she just simply fell asleep in a chair and dropped a cigarette in her lap, and overnight, poof, she became something that you normally can't reproduce in a crematorium retort. It's a nice fable, but it doesn't seem to work at all, as the debunkers, as the naysayers would like everyone to believe. This is Dr. Krogman, as we said, a world-famous forensic anthropologist in his day who had specialized in his career, among other things, of determining the effects of fire in various living tissues. We sat down with Dr. Krogman and reviewed the case with him with some reluctance, we might add. Initially, he didn't particularly want to recall the Mary Reeser case when we met with him in the 1970s, because a quarter century had elapsed by then, and this still clearly bothered him. What perplexed him at the time when he was in St. Pete doing his original investigation and inquiries into the Reeser case was, one, the extended reduction to her body, which we've already described, the localization of the heat, which we've also addressed. The photo below him shows a morgue shot of what was shoveled, literally shoveled out of Mary Reese's apartment. It's the 1 foot, the satin slipper that had encased that foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, as we said, and that ovoid mass in the top of photo above her foot is arguably her shrunken skull, which also concerned Dr. Krogman significantly. As we said, also, there was the absence of the noxious smell of burned flesh. And as Krogman said to us, this was an affront to common sense as understood by firefighters in his day, and in fact to this day, as well as common sense to his medical professional practice of experimentation on various types of tissues. He didn't want to consider spontaneous human combustion, as he said it was monotonously consistent pattern, which also gives the lie to mere coincidence, because he thought at the time that history had presented several other cases that were comparable to what he himself was looking at with the Reeser case. She was burned so bad that she was nicknamed, as the caption says, Mary Reeser was known as the Cinder Woman. When we last spoke with the St. Pete Police Department back in 1995, The case, we were told, was still open at that time. They had not closed the case. This was some 50 years after Mary met her remarkable demise.
This was the case that brought this to the public, right? This
Yes.
was the,
Yes.
how do people react to this? I mean, did they ignore it? Like, was it covered by a lot of, news media at that time? Like, what was the general vibe?
At the time, this, as we said, was front page news in the St. Petersburg Times newspaper and the Tampa Tribune newspapers. Both newspapers covered the oddity of the fire. They quoted official investigators who were perplexed by what confronted them when they arrived at Mrs. Reese's apartment that morning. We did supply with another graphic. We spoke to the police officer who was stationed as security at the front door of Mary Reese's apartment. This was Officer Tipton's first day on duty with the St. Pete Police Department. And he told us that as he secured the premises, he would watch and listen to other investigators enter and leave the site. And he said they were all mystified, all perplexed. They had no idea how to explain what they had just come from looking at. The other gentleman is Nelson Aders. He was one of the two firemen who actually helped to shovel up Mary's ashes from the apartment. And he acknowledged to us that as a professional firefighter, he had never been to a fire prior to or since responding to the Reeser scene that was anywhere emblematic, similar to this particular very bizarre fire fatality. He told us that in his view, Mary Reeser died by spontaneous human combustion, an astonishing admission by a professional firefighter. Here's a close-up of Mary's remains. She weighed about 175 pounds the evening of July 1st, 1951. The morning of July 2nd, what was shoveled out of her apartment, which included some springs from the chair in which she was known to be last seated, weighed about 8 pounds. A remarkable reduction of a human being.
But like, what was the public perception of this? Did they, I mean, apart from the people who investigated it, like, how did people respond to this? Were they just like, oh, this is just an anomaly? I mean, because we've never heard of this before? Or...
Yeah. As we've been able to look back at the historical record, the initial public response seemed to be one of great curiosity and reasonably high degree of interest. This was a mystery. This was a real life bona fide mystery that demanded some answers and raised a lot of questions. But what we've discovered in the decades that we've devoted to researching this phenomenon in general, after the initial curiosity wears off, people tend to want to forget about it. This is an incredibly mysterious, but also emotionally quite disturbing phenomenon and subject. The fact that you can be sitting in a chair in apparently good health one moment and the next moment be discovered looking like Mrs. Reeser is for many people not only intimidating, but frightful and horrific. And we've discovered that not just for the general public, but also for professional firefighters, it's much easier to forget about an event like this than it is to pursue it in search of an answer and solutions to how this came to be.
Yeah, this is really perplexing and unfortunately not the only such case. What was the next big case that kind of like took the public by surprise?
Well, we plowed through other newspapers and medical textbooks at the medical library at the College of Physicians down in Philadelphia, the medical libraries at the Hershey Med Center near us, looking for other cases that might be parallel to what we knew had happened to Mrs. Reeser. We found some, but these cases tend to be historically quite old, maybe 100 years old, 200 years old. And the argument that the naysayers would throw at us, well, these are old cases, they were misreported, people weren't intelligent enough or educated sufficiently back in those days to understand that these people were really burning up in dropped cigarettes or carelessly discarded candles still lit or something along that line. So we're thinking maybe, just maybe, Mary Reeser was a one-off case that had something just that nobody was able to discover the supposedly simple cause to. That assessment rapidly and dramatically changed for us in 1975 when we were tipped off to a case that we were told might be similar to what happened to Mary Reeser. It happened here in Pennsylvania, in northern Pennsylvania, in Coudersport, Potter County, in 1966. We made some phone calls. Each person that we spoke to who ostensibly had some involvement in this case gave us information that made us more and more curious. We decided to spend a weekend in Coudersport, Pennsylvania, looking into the fire fatality of one gentleman named Dr. John Irving Bentley. We spoke to the coroner. We spoke to the deputy coroner. We spoke to the gentleman who said he discovered the remains of Dr. Bentley, which we'll describe in a moment. We spoke to several firefighters who helped extricate the ashes of Dr. Bentley from his home on North Main Street in Coudersport. We had a lot of information that sounded very much like what happened to Mary Weiser in 1951, now in our home state of Pennsylvania in 1966. The last person we spoke to on that weekend in a field investigation was a newspaper editor who said he had taken photographs of the fire scene. He said he would never publish them because they were so disturbing, but if he could find them in his files, he would send them to us and we could do whatever we wanted with them because, as we said, he would never publish them. About a week later, we got an envelope from him, tentatively and with great anticipation, opened it and discovered a set of photographs that just blew us away and confirmed for us that what history had called spontaneous human combustion, what we presently prefer to term sudden human cremation, is not a myth, it's not a superstition, it's not a contrivance of someone with great imagination. This is a real, bona fide medical mystery that is crying out for solution and documentation. Dr. Bentley's death in December 5, 1966, is a legacy, pun intended, that left behind half of one of his legs, a piece of patella, his kneecap, a head that was so badly damaged that it was found lying by some of the first responders on water pipes, but so badly damaged that the other first responders could not recognize that it was a head. The rest of Dr. Bentley's 92-year-old body had immolated through the floor in his bathroom and ended up a pile of ashes, dry powder, on his earthen basement floor, and pile of ash about 14 inches in diameter, 5 inches in height. This is the first of the photographs that we pulled out of that envelope that said, my God, what the heck happened here?
This photograph, this is what first turned me on to this subject right here.
This single photograph captures so perfectly the concept of classic spontaneous human combustion, an incredibly localized, apparently quite fearsome fire that can consume a human adult to, as we said, mostly dry powder, and yet fail to significantly damage by heat or any other energy associated with a blazing combustion surrounding combustibles that are much more easily burned than is the human body. The human body generally is almost fire impervious. It's very difficult under normal circumstances to burn up a human body. Arson criminalists, arson murderers have tried to do this with great difficulty. Even using an accelerant such as gasoline makes the challenge quite profound. There was no accelerant involved at the Dr. Bentley fire scene. We stood in his bathroom. We are 6 feet high. We could reach our arm up and touch the ceiling. Above this hole in the floor, there was not a scorch mark to the ceiling. Dr. Bentley was semi-invalidic. He had broken his hip many years prior and used an aluminum walker to help him locomote through his 2-room apartment. The aluminum walker, as you can see, is intact. Aluminum will melt at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. On the legs of the walker remained 2 rubber tips intact. Dr. Bentley's bathtub, on which the walker rested, was painted with enamel paint. You can see where the paint is blackened, but that paint did not blister. We stood in this bathroom and we will attest to that. Oaken beams were burned partially through. The one most severely damaged in the middle is almost burned through in half. It takes many hours for oak wood to burn to that extent. The linoleum was covered with a tar-based, old, dried linoleum, very flammable. As you can see, beyond the 2 by 3.5 or 2.5 by 3.5 foot hole through which Dr. Bentley's body descended into the basement, the linoleum did not continue to fuel the blaze. Dr. Bentley himself offered very little fuel load to this combustion event. He was dressed in a robe, cotton undergarments. Those two items plus one leather slipper in his body was the fuel loading available to incinerate himself largely to powder. Doc Gosnell is the inset. He was the gentleman. He worked as a meter reader for West Penn Gas at the time. He walked into Dr. Bentley's home to read the gas meter in the basement. Here's the gentleman who told us that when he was down in the basement, having finished the meter reading, he spun around and his flashlight beam caught a pile of something on the earthen floor in one corner. Mr. Gosnell, at the time, besides being a meter reader, was a volunteer fireman in Countersport. He was curious. He walked over and kicked that mound of ash with his work boot, saw no embers. He looked overhead and saw the other side of this hole from the basement looking up, rimmed with cherry red embers. Gosnell told us that he thought, must have been a fire overnight. Wonder what burned up, and I wonder why the fire department didn't get a call to put it out. When he went back upstairs and before leaving the house, Countersport being a friendly little community back in 1966, he rapped on the door to make sure that Dr. Bentley was well and yelled a greeting that got no response. Gosnell opened the unlocked door, walked into the doctor's sitting room, did not see him where he normally would have been found sitting in his chair, and stuck his head around the corner of the bathroom. And his first reaction was, there's a mannequin leg on the floor. Wonder what Dr. Bentley was doing with a mannequin leg. And then when Gosnell stooped down closer, he realized that this was not a mannequin leg. This was half of a human leg. He bolted from the house down the street, ran into his office, and yelled the understatement, we believe in 1966, Dr. Bentley's burned up. And yet naysayers say that such a thing absolutely cannot happen. Dr. Lester Adelson, a pathologist in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, wrote an article about why spontaneous human combustion cannot occur. It has to be a myth, the product of superstitious or uneducated people. When that photograph of Dr. Bentley was handed to Dr. Adelson for comment, his reaction was, this is a hoax. Asked why this photograph had to be a hoax, he said, because bodies do not burn this way. We know the provenance of that photograph. This is in the days before Photoshop. This photograph is a historical, genuine documentation of a quote unquote impossible event. We did ask Dr. Adelson if he had ever investigated the case of spontaneous human combustion. Had he ever gone to a fire scene where this was ostensibly occurring? His answer was no, but he knows better. He doesn't need to go to one of these fire scenes, as we have done several times, because he said, as this caption shows, I do not for a single second buy the overheated concept of spontaneous human combustion. It's a hoax because, as we've already said, according to him, bodies don't burn this way. Well, Dr. Adelson, yes, they do. And therein lies the mystery of sudden human cremation, because he had no way to explain this other than calling it a hoax.
It's unbelievable how there are so many skeptical explanations to this, and some of them just, they don't make any sense. What are some of the most outlandish explanations that you've come across?
Oh, golly, most outlandish. How many can we list? Probably the most outlandish is the dreaded phosphenic fart theory.
What?
And this you know, high school kids go to the laboratory and light their flatulence, or try to. And this is actually seriously proposed as the explanation for why people like Dr. Bentley would end up looking like this, or why Mary Reeser would end up looking like she did. If that theory has any merit whatsoever, we would expect to find lots of teenagers in high school bathrooms or into piles of powder. We do not find that situation whatsoever. So we've written that one off as an outlandish theory that has absolutely no physical, mental, or psychological, or intellectual significance or merit to it whatsoever. The theory that is most often proposed is the Wick effect. And if you've seen any of the programs that have appeared on television, often by us or involving us, you'll find the human candle wick theory proffered endlessly as the solution to so-called spontaneous human combustion. It's basically this. You take an external ignition source like a match or a cigarette or a broken butane lighter, and ideally you add a lot of alcohol to it and then throw in a person and you end up with question mark, Mary Reeser or Dr. Bentley or hundreds of other similar cases that we found in our research throughout the world over several centuries. When we first began our research, we thought, could this be? Does this work? We did our own experiments. Every one of them failed laughably. And if memory serves, 1999, we did a program for the BBC. They came to our house first. And at that time, we had for 1 year marinated a ham shank, ham with a bone, in a marinade of whiskey, bourbon, and brandy. And we said, we'll take this out of the refrigerator. We'll wrap it in a cotton cloth. We'll put it on a old tar-based linoleum flooring and put that on a plank of wood, just like you would have found in Dr. Bentley's bathroom. And then we will light it, and you can film it. And if it burns to powder, we'll be surprised, but you will have captured, anyway, whatever the result of the experiment, you will have it on film. After about an hour, the flame, this was done outside with infinite amount of oxygen to fuel the combustion. After about an hour, the fire self-extinguished. We unwrapped the still intact cotton around the ham shank, and the ham shank in part had superficial charring, but was like 98 to 90% intact, not a pile of dried powder. The producer for that BBC production was next scheduled to go to California to meet with Dr. John DeHaan, a renowned fire scientist, and he had promised the BBC that he could prove SHC was a myth by proving that human candlewick can burn something to powder. The last thing we said to the producer before he left our office here in Harrisburg en route to California was, if John DeHaan can do what he claims he can do, it will be historically and scientifically very significant. But don't let him use an accelerant like gasoline on his burn sample. When the program aired, guess what John DeHaan used in his burning of a pig, which was his stand-in for the human body? He poured a liter of gasoline on the burn sample. Well, of course, that's going to fuel combustion. That's going to exacerbate the fire. But we don't find accelerants in classic cases of spontaneous human combustion. So we conducted a really bizarre and totally inappropriate scientific experiment. But John wasn't done with that. He was given another opportunity on a program that aired on the Learning Channel a couple years later, this time as a stand-in for the human body instead of using a pig carcass, which is appropriate to do. We have no argument with that. But this time, instead of a pig carcass, he used a fistful of candles, about a dozen candles that he wrapped in cotton cloth and laid on a chair. And then he lit it. And he stands there in the burn chamber saying, look, I've got a small localized blaze. This is going to end up looking just like these photos that Larry claims is spontaneous human combustion. Ha ha. Well, the fire got bigger, and then it got bigger, and then it got bigger. And it got so big that John DeHaan decided, it's not comfortable nor safe to be in this burn chamber. He exited the burn chamber. When the program cuts back, the fire is out, and John is standing there saying, look, we've had a localized blaze. It went out. Minimal surrounding fire damage to newspapers that he had put on an end table next to his chair. This is also supposed to represent a case that occurred in Bolingbrook, Illinois in 1979, when in fact he was replicating a case that happened in Pennsylvania. Again in Pennsylvania back in 1966 to Howard Conway, and we'll probably get to that case in a short time. But he stands there with a chair that is minimally damaged, telling the world that he's just proven the wick effect has disproved the concept of spontaneous human combustion. What John knew, but this program did not display, was that this was not at all what actually happened, because the production company that did this program from TLC had sent to us before this program aired their original production that they had sent to TLC. And their original production very dramatically and quite significantly in one small detail from what the viewing public got to see. And what originally happened in the burn chamber was not a small fire that self-extinguished, but a roaring inferno that was within moments, probably seconds, of full flashover. John had extricated himself by that time from the fire chamber because it was way too hot to be inside. The cameraman himself had to back out, and fire suppression equipment was ordered to extinguish this roaring inferno. John knew that this was not a small, localized fire. And then he goes back into the burn chamber after the fire is extinguished to tell the viewing public that he successfully replicated a localized, low heat, smoldering fire that he believes explains cases like Dr. Bentley and Mary Weiser. We're going to be very blunt with you. That's a lie. And John knows it's a lie. Why he did this remains a mystery to us, as great as that of spontaneous human combustion itself. He is well regarded in the fire service community, and yet why he would so misrepresent what happened here in an effort to debunk and dismiss SHC is itself a story in its all to itself.
Yeah, that's a shame when those things.
It shows the extreme that we have had to encounter over now 40 plus years of investigating this phenomenon, and we believe investigating it thoroughly, competently, and above all, honestly. We have been led to cases that were presented to us as SHC, and we found reasons to dismiss that assessment. We could find conventional explanations for some of these cases. And when we've done that, we have said so in our book, ABLAZE. On the other hand, we're not going to lie about the cases that we've documented. We're not going to make up quotes. We have spent countless hours talking to the first responders, those who have been actually at these fire scenes, and in some cases, we ourselves have been able to be at these remarkable fire scenes. We know what the fire scenes look like. We know what the odors were like. We know that accelerants were not involved. We know that fire suppression equipment was not brought in. And yet, when we try to present this evidence to people in the mainstream fire service community, we are met again and again and again with rebuff, with dismissal, and in some cases, with just laughable circumstances. When we went down to the National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, just before wrapping up writing of our book, ABLAZE, we tried to meet with three senior fire instructors who were on duty that day. One of them expressed mild interest, but didn't want to see any of the photos. The second instructor to whom we attempted to hand the photos literally spun on his heels and ran down the hallway saying, "I don't want to see those." The third instructor happened to be walking by when that incident occurred. He paused, he came over, looked at our photographs and said, "Hey, you know what? Come into my office, sit down and tell me everything you know, because we don't have a clue." He was genuinely interested. We'd like to see that happen in all areas and all levels of the professional fire services. Unfortunately, that's not been our experience. Memorably, when we were down in Philadelphia looking at several cases in the Philadelphia area, one of them was the Conway case, which we'll get to later. We sat down in the office of one of their senior fire investigators and put the photographs of Mary Weiser, Dr. Bentley, and Helen Conway on his desk and said, "You're the expert. We're the amateur. Help us understand how these fires could have occurred. We'd like to know. How would you react if you were called to a fire scene and you discovered a fire scene that looked like one of these photographs? What would you do?" We shall never forget his answer to us. It was this, quote unquote, "I'd go out, I'd get drunk, and I'd forget about it."
We're going to pull up the photo of the Conway case here. Now, this took place in Upper Darby, right, in 1964?
Yes, yeah, right.
The Conway case, the Reeser case, the Bentley case, they shared something in common, didn't they?
Let's see. They were all humans. They were all fairly elderly. Two were female, one was male. They all lived, well, no, we're going to say they all lived alone, but they didn't. Dr. Bentley did live alone. Mary Weiser lived in a by herself in an apartment, but others were in the apartment building nearby. And Helen Conway lived with her family. Two family members were downstairs on Sunday morning when this episode transpired. Other members of the family had left shortly before this fire scene was discovered, and they were away at church that Sunday morning. What do you see as the common factor, Justin?
Well, I remember you talking about this before, and I'm just going to put it out there so that we can kind of discuss this, because I'm sure a lot of the skeptics bring this into the equation too. And correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't all three of those victims, they were known smokers, right?
Helen Conway was a heavy smoker, reasonably heavy smoker. That is correct. Mary Reeser was said to be a smoker also. Dr. Bentley, on the other hand, was a pipe smoker. And while it's been argued by many of the naysayers that Dr. Bentley, the reason for his smoking mishap was that he was sitting in his chair and dropped the pipe in his lap, or dropped embers from that pipe in his lap, and consequently caught his robo flame, and spent the next 5 minutes hobbling with his walker from his sitting chair to the bathroom in search of water to quench the fiery robe that he was engulfed in. Now, some problems with that as we see it. One, the first responders noticed that when they arrived at the Bentley household, Dr. Bentley's pipe was in its holder on a stand next to his chair. If Dr. Bentley had dropped a lit pipe in his lap and caught his robe aflame, it's unlikely, in fact, we would argue that it's nonsensical, that he would have reached into his burning lap to pick up the pipe and put it neatly in its holder next to his chair before trying to extricate himself from his fiery situation. Secondly, Dr. Bentley was largely infirm. As we said, according to his nurse, whom we interviewed, it took Bentley 5 minutes to walk from his chair to the bathroom with his walker. If his robe were afire at the time, what he would have done, he was infirm but not insane. He was very cogent, mentally keen. He would have done what his medical training had told him to do in a fire situation, which would have been to drop and roll or get out of a burning garment. It's argued by Joe Nickel and other skeptics that Dr. Bentley hobbled with his garments aflame, setting the carpeting in his sitting room aflame as he slowly transgressed across the room to the bathroom in search of water to put out his fiery robe. Doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Yes, he had spark holes in his robe. He had spark holes allegedly on other garments, but what made this particular night of December 5, 1966, so remarkable that in all the previous times that he had spark holes in his garments, every time those garments did not inflame, what made it so unique this evening, and only this evening, that an alleged spark hole or dropped ember from his pipe caused him to become a raging inferno more intense than can be accomplished in normal conditions in a crematorium retort? That's the question none of the naysayers can address and answer properly.
That's why I brought that up, because it doesn't account for all the cases either, because not everybody is a smoker.
You're absolutely right, Justin. Absolutely right. If we go back to the Conway overview again, we can address that point further. The gentleman in the insert is Fire Chief Paul Haggerty. He was one of the first responders. We interviewed Chief Haggerty at great length, as well as at the time, the fire photographer who later became the fire marshal for Upper Darby, Bob Meslin, as well as the assistant fire marshal, Harry Lott. All three gentlemen confirmed the details of this remarkable fire scene. Paul Haggerty himself had been to several fire fatalities in which dropped cigarettes had indeed been the cause of the blaze. But as Paul Haggerty said to us, and in fact, he showed us photographs of some of those fire scenes, none of the victims in those fire scenes were burned to the extent that Helen Conway was. The bodies were completely intact in the burned chairs. They could be taken to a morgue and completely autopsied. Internal organs existed. And those fires took a long time. What so astounded Chief Haggerty, Fire Marshal Meslin, and Deputy Fire Marshal Lott was, in the Conway case, not only the extent of destruction to her body, but the time frame in which this event happened. We have correspondence from those gentlemen, Bob Meslin in particular. The initial correspondence said that no more than 21 minutes could have elapsed from the time that Mrs. Conway was known to be alive until the firemen arrived to put out a fire that really did not need to be put out. When they first arrived, the room was filled with dense black smoke. That's a bit atypical, but there was no odor of noxious burned human flesh. There was no fire damage to the ceiling overhead. In fact, the first responder who went in on his hands and knees knew that a person had lived in this room. He went in on his hands and knees in complete opaqueness, with his forearm outstretched looking for Mrs. Conway. He put his hand in something, he did not know exactly what, but presumed that he had touched Mrs. Conway, and presumed that at that point she had deceased. When the smoke ejection equipment was brought in and the room air was cleared out, he realized that where he put his hand was in the lap of Mrs. Conway. And we were told it was a very long time before that firefighter would respond to another fire call involving human or just property. Very psychologically disturbing to him, and understandably so. But coming back to that 20-minute time frame, when we sat down in Bob Meslin's kitchen and went over the photographs that he kindly gave to us, he took 12 photographs. This is just one of them, of this remarkable fire scene. When we worked the timeline with him, we learned that from the time that the fire department got the call, made the response, realized that this is a fire fatality, Mr. Meslin was sent from the fire scene back to get his camera and return and take a dozen photographs. We can narrow that 21-minute time frame down to an astonishingly impossible 360 seconds, 6 minutes, based on all the interviews with the first responders that we had the privilege to meet. You cannot, under any known conditions, other than perhaps a high temperature accelerant, incinerate a body to this extent. Certainly not in a crematorium retort, and not without lots of filters and lots of fuel and the noxious odor of burned human flesh. There are so many aspects to the Conway case. We kept this confidential for many years. In fact, it was incredibly difficult to even find this case. We really lucked out. The universe was fortuitously behind us, tracking this photo down. We discovered this case by attending an advanced arson fire science course at the Pennsylvania Fire Academy. And at the end of that course, the instructor, Buzz Trebold, pulled out a photograph and said, "Hey, I just got this photograph, and some people say it's spontaneous human combustion. A lady burned up and in a chair." And he passed the photograph around to the classmates. And before it got to us, we turned to a firefighter sitting next to us, and we said, "Oh, this has got to be the Reeser case." So we're talking about what happened to Mary Reeser. And then the photograph ended up in our hands, so we looked at it and said, "Holy shit, this is not Mary Reeser. This is a case we know nothing about." So as soon as the class was dismissed, we went up to Buzz Trebold and said, "Who, where, when, what, we want to track this down." He said, "I don't know, other than this is a fire that happened somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania." Well, those folks who know the geography of Pennsylvania know that that's Philadelphia, the most populous part of Pennsylvania. Justin, you certainly know this.
Yeah.
How are we going to find a fire fatality in southeastern Pennsylvania when we have no name, no date, no fire department, nothing but a photograph? It took us 9 months, but we tracked it down and we found this photograph and got in touch with Bob Meslin and the other fire officials, and the rest is history. We sat on this case until we had the book published. So Book ABLAZE is the first public debut of this remarkable human incineration. It's just bizarre. And once again, it fits the hallmark conditions of what history has called spontaneous human combustion, an apparently fearsome yet highly localized blaze that is capable of reducing a body beyond all common sense. One of our critics, Mark Benecke, says that spontaneous human combustion cannot occur, as the caption of this photo from Dr. Adelson says, "Bodies don't burn this way." Well, Dr. Adelson, this one did. Mark Benecke says that spontaneous human combustion doesn't happen because there is no case in history where internal organs are burned more severely than our external body parts. Ergo, these bodies all have to burn from the outside inward, not from the inside outward. Well, once again, Mark Benecke, as a student well educated as he is about all things forensic and biology, he's flat out wrong. In Dr. Bentley's case, there was no internal organ left, other than perhaps the brain in his skull. We do not know that, but no heart, no liver, no pancreas, no bile duct, no lungs. We say the same for Mary Reeser. So those two cases alone belie Mark Benecke's argument that there is no case where internal body parts of a corpse are damaged more severely than the outer parts. He's flat out wrong, and we've got the photographic proof that he's flat out wrong.
I mean, it's just so remarkable that this is happening at all. The different burn degrees, in the classification, right? This is a 5th degree burn. This has got to be added to the burn degrees, right? And currently it does not exist.
Exactly. Excellent point, Justin. When we began our research, there were 3 degrees of burn injury: first, second, and third. First is reddening of the skin, mild sunburn. Second is blistering of the skin, very bad sunburn. We've had that. We know what a second degree burn looks like. We know what it feels like. Third degree burn was everything else. Then the fire service industry came up with a 4th and a 5th degree burn category. 4th degree was when you had damage subcutaneously. 5th degree is when there's deep char to muscle tissue. Okay. Dr. Bentley, Mary Reeser, and others exhibited something far beyond deep muscle char burn damage. These people ashened to dry powder. So if fire service presently says 5th degree is the most serious burn, then these cases warrant a whole new classification. 6th degree burn. Some fire officials are now arguing for a 6th degree burn, which is very deep char burn into the skeleton, in which case then these cases have to be a 7th degree burn, because not just internal organs are damaged and destroyed. The skeleton, the bone matrix itself, is completely ashened. And even in a crematorium, in a retort where temperatures can reach 22 to 2400 degrees for an hour to an hour and a half, what is raked out of a retort oven is bone fragment, not just ashes, but bone fragments. Those fragments are put in a cremulator, a mechanical device that grinds those bone fragments to powder. Dr. Krogman told us in his experiments, if the temperature was under 3000 degrees for 12 hours, he could pull out of the burn oven bone fragments that, with his background and knowledge in forensic anthropology, he could identify. And yet in cases like Mary Reeser and Dr. Bentley and retired firefighter George Mott in upstate New York in 1986, the bone is calcined. It is powder. It does not have to be ground up because it crumbles to dust when touched.
Let's touch on that Mott case now, because this is one of the best documented cases, and it plays into the whole smoking aspect. But here's why. He was a smoker, but he stopped cold turkey 15 years before this, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you can't use that to explain this, here.
Well, it's been tried, and we'll love to get into the ludicrousness of the attempt to try to write off George Mott as a smoking mishap. But anyway, this is George Mott, upper left, retired firefighter, fought fires in Tioga, upstate New York. In 1966, he had retired to this wooden 20 by 40 foot house, tinderbox of an environment actually, on the outskirts of Crown Point, New York, outside of Ticonderoga. In late March, he had not been visited by had checked in with his family for about a day and a half prior to his son, Kendall Mott, going out to this house to check on his dad. The front door, probably you can't see it in this photograph, but there's a sign on the front door that says no smoking. George Mott had smoked, as you correctly point out, 10 or 15 years earlier, but had quit cold turkey. He was now an avowed non-smoker. And while his son Kendall did smoke, the only way Kendall could smoke around his dad's house was to go outside to smoke. George Mott refused to allow anyone inside his house smoking. The irony of this is that in late March of 1986, George Mott himself went up in smoke in a way that made no sense to any of the investigators at the time whom we interviewed at length, with one exception. George Mott was discovered by a friend of his son, Kendall, in the back room of the house. We were at this fire scene twice. When you walk in the front door past the sign that says no smoking, you walked into George Mott's living room. There was some discoloration near the top of the walls and on the ceiling in the living room. This is an incredibly complicated, complex, and quite bizarre fire scene. We discussed it thoroughly in our book ABLAZE, and even more thoroughly in a separate publication we did for the Info Journal. But if you walk through the living room to the rear of the house, through that open doorway, you can see what looks like the headboard of a bed, which is exactly what it is. In that bed, George Mott had laid down and met a flaming fate that belied everything he had previously encountered as a professional volunteer firefighter. He managed to burn himself through his mattress, through the wood flooring below the bed, and ended up, as the first responders told us, a pile of calcined powder on the earthen floor below his bed. On his bed, he left behind half of one leg. We have lectured for almost 20 years, maybe longer than 20 years, to students of fire science at the Harrisburg Area Community College on this subject. When we put this photograph up to them, we say, in this photograph is a body part. Can you find it? And all that time, we think we've had one student who was able to come close to finding the body part. Firefighters cannot find George Mott's leg, but with the arrows pointed out, the arrow on the right are the toes of George Mott's right leg. Left arrow points to where that right leg had burned clean off just around the kneecap, reminiscent, of course, of Dr. Bentley's remaining one leg, half leg, his legacy, if you will, to the fire phenomenon that we're discussing with you this evening. The rest of George Mott's body, as we said, was powder burned through the mattress into the floor below. The shape of the mattress is in a deep V, suggesting to us that George Mott, the incineration of his body, had a vector that was strongly forceful downward. We say these people do not burn up, they burn down. We were in the bed in this bedroom after the leg had been removed, but nothing else had significantly been changed. Once again, we could stretch our arm towards the ceiling and touch the ceiling. The ceiling is basically pristine. It is not burned, it is not charred. So how do we explain this? Well, we look first at electrical outlets. Could an electric arc from one of the outlets in George Mott's bedroom cause this incredible fire? No. There was no evidence of electrical arcing in any of the outlets in the bedroom. That was confirmed by the county fire investigator and by the emergency director for Essex County as well, Bob Purdy. We did talk to a member of the BCI, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation in New York, and he insisted that yes, indeed, an electrical arc had caused this. Well, we tore those electrical outlets apart, as did the local fire officials, and we will tell you there was no evidence of electrical arcing whatsoever. There are strange artifacts, well, there are artifacts that were strangely burned or melted elsewhere in George Mott's home. The photo on the left shows where a plastic paddled fly swatter had hung. The middle arm of the fly swatter is still hanging on the wall, but the pinpoint is pointing to where the plastic had been. It's now completely melted away. The photo on the right, beside that photo, is a thermometer at the far end of the house. You can see that it is melted, but the mercury did not rupture above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Below is a photograph that we took in George Mott's library at the other extreme of the house, about 25 feet away from George Mott's bedroom. Once again, the thermometer did not break, but it shows a bit of heat distortion. A plastic container that held tissues. The plastic is melted partially, but the tissues inside the box did not catch fire. George Mott had an eclectic collection of reading material. One of the books was a book by Reader's Digest that contained, believe it or not, a chapter discussing spontaneous human combustion. We took that as an artifact to study later. It was analyzed in conjunction with M. Sue Benford, a brilliant scientist associated with Ohio State University. And the analysis of that book jacket, the sooting on it, indicated that this had to be some kind of a nuclear event because the dating of the paper was way off. Other factors indicated that this had to be some kind of a nuclear type event, certainly not an oxidizing type of combustion event. As to George Mott being a smoker or not being a smoker, next to George Mott's bedroom, next to his bed, in the bedroom was an oxygen enrichment machine. So there was an increased amount of oxygen slightly available in his bedroom. But on top of the machine was a canister of long-handled wooden stick matches. One of our critics, I'm sure many of your participants will recognize the name, Joe Nickel, looks at that canister of matches and goes, aha, matches. Why would those matches be there? Well, they must be there because George Mott decided that after 10 or 15 years of being an avowed, confirmed non-smoker, he suddenly, this night in late March 1986, decided that he just had to have one more cigarette. And that's why those matches are there. He used one of those matches to light a cigarette, and gosh darn it, he either dropped the cigarette or he had a heart attack and dropped the lit cigarette or match on his pajamas, and darn it, he slowly emanated to that pile of powder that we found underneath his bed. End of mystery, Larry. It's not spontaneous human combustion at all. Well, you know what, Mr. Nickel? The reason those matches were there was not because George Mott had this bizarre craving after a decade or more of being a non-smoker. The matches were there because on the other side of Mr. Mott's bedroom was the furnace that heated Mr. Mott's 20 by 40 foot ramshackle tinderbox of a home. The matches were there because he used it to light the oil burner, not because he had a craving for a cigarette. This is the kind of insidious, make-believe, let's just suppose argument that critics have to rely upon in order not to confront the facts of these remarkable human incinerations.
I tend to think that when a lot of the skeptics come into the equation and they try to process it using human logic, using frames of references that only make sense in their own world, instead of considering that there is another world, one full of mystery, one full of things we do not understand. And no matter how disturbing that world may be, we have to accept it as a possibility, as a reality. And we've covered a lot of cases where the victims did not survive, but there have been a bunch of cases where they have survived, right?
Yes, yes. At least let's say it is our assessment and our conclusion that not only does sudden human cremation occur in these remarkable fatality cases, these remarkable fatal fire scenes, but we actually can come back and defend spontaneous human combustion for the survivors of partial bizarre human burnings.